Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. Like many people, I have been thinking about the situation that we're facing on a global level right now. And thinking about the way that the Dhamma relates to that. And at this time when we are, if we're listening, if we're checking in, because some of us have chosen not to do that for our own health and well-being, but if you're listening and checking in, you're hearing daily reports about folks becoming ill, folks dying, economic tragedies, a lot of suffering that's in the world that's very present to us right now. And we recently, a couple weeks ago, we celebrated Wesak, celebrated the birth, enlightenment, and death of the Buddha, as it's celebrated in the Theravada, all on one day. And at that time, it's very typical to reflect on the Buddha's life. The Buddha is a human being who was born and discovered the path to enlightenment, and then shared it by walking around teaching for 45 years. And the Buddha himself was motivated to begin his journey of awakening by precisely this kind of news, by his encounters with sickness, old age, and death. Right? As if for the first time, it's said that he encountered this. And he became really deeply aware of his own mortality. And rather than falling into despair or denial, the Buddha used that realization to motivate him. In Pali, the word is samvega. And this word is variously translated. Sometimes it's known as spiritual urgency, or I think it's the Pali Text Society that translates it also as agitation, or even grief. Sometimes it's translated as grief. But I like to think of it, samvega, as that, as motivation, as turning this this sharp feeling into something that will help to move us forward on the spiritual path. And so when the Buddha realized this was very deeply struck with his own mortality, then he left home, he left his family behind. And set out on the, set his heart basically on discovering something that had not been discovered before, which is the resolution to suffering. And so he did this because he realized that it wasn't just his own problem. And it wasn't just his family's problem. And it wasn't just his country's problem. It is the whole world's problem. Right? It always has been. It always has been. And so he set out, and there's a beautiful sutta that tells this story. We did a little bit of sutta contemplation on the sutta that tells the story of the Buddha's going forth. And one of the things that struck me about that sutta, that story, is the confidence that the Buddha had. Even though at that point he was still the bodhisattva, he had not awakened yet. And he didn't even really know how he was going to get from here to there. But he had a confidence that he could find it, that somehow he would find it. And so what I propose is that for us, there is also this question. There's also this question before us, right? When we are faced with this kind of situation in the world, when we are faced perhaps with our own family members getting sick, or getting old, or dying. My own mom was diagnosed with COVID a few weeks back. My mom, she lives in a nursing home out in Durham, North Carolina, close to where my sister lives. And so far we've been fortunate. So far she's had a very mild case, and she was actually moved out of the COVID ward last week. But not everyone has had that experience. But certainly lots of us have, lots of us. We are all impacted in one way or another. But the question before us is, can we at this time take that impact, take that information in, and turn it toward a practice that leads to freedom? How can we find our confidence in the Dhamma at a time like this? So I want to tell you a little bit of a story from the days when my daughter was very young, when she was a little girl, which I hope will be a good metaphor for how we can develop some confidence in the Dhamma. So Kayla's my daughter's name. Kayla was maybe about 4 or 5 years old, maybe even less than that. Yeah, probably about 4. When we had the incredible good fortune, the privilege actually, of living in a house that had a pool. So I want to just acknowledge that not everybody has access to a pool, even public pools. There are many people who experience discrimination and harassment around pools. But in this case, my family had the privilege of being in that place, and I wanted her to be safe around the pool. So I said, well, This was in Florida. So I said, well, what I'd like is for her to learn how to float, because it might take some time for her to learn how to swim, but maybe I could teach her how to float on the water in case she fell in, and she'd be safe, she'd be okay. But the problem was that I myself had learned to float before I can remember. I didn't really know how to do that, what the process was of learning how to float, because when I was a little girl, at that very, very young age, we also lived in Florida, and so I was taught, and I don't recall. As far as I know, I've always known how to float in this lifetime, but somebody taught me at some point. So I thought, well, we'll figure it out together. So we got in the pool, Kayla and I, and I held her up on top of the water, and I said, you know, what I thought would be some helpful instructions, like, okay, just relax, you know, the water will hold you up, and just, you know, try to lay flat, you'll be okay, the water will hold you up. So then I would let my hands down, and then she would start to sink into the water. And because she didn't know how to float yet, she was still, you know, sinking. And in fact, the only thing that she knew about the water was that if you threw a rock in, because she would do this sometimes, throw a rock in the pool. If you throw a rock in, it sinks to the bottom. That's what she knew about water up until that point, and that you bathe in it and things like that. But as far as she was concerned, it was like that. Things that went in the pool would sink. So there we were. So we did this a few times, quite a number of times. And I finally kind of clued in, like, okay, she's not going to learn it this way. There's something else that's needed here. So I thought about it a little bit more, and about the mechanics of it a little bit more. And this was happening, you know, over the course of days. I thought about it a little bit more, and the mechanics of what was happening. So the next time we got in the pool, I said to her, okay, Kayla, what you need to do is you need to lean your head back. So just lean your head as far back as it'll go without getting water up your nose, but like lean your head as far back as it'll go, and then you'll be able to float. And so she leaned her head back, and I put my hands down, and after a few tries of that, then, oh, lo and behold, I took my hands away, and there she was floating. And so I'm telling you this story because for me, this is very emblematic of how we develop in the Dhamma, how we develop a kind of trust in the Dhamma. Right? It's a good metaphor for that. So one aspect is we need some good friends. We need some friends who will help to tell us how this works. We need to have a bit of courage to get in the water. We need to be willing to go through some trial and error, make some mistakes, and see what doesn't work as well. Listen to the advice that we're given. But then when we do that, when we actually find our harmony with the water, in Kayla's case, when she found her harmony, her natural, innate harmony with the water, then it showed her this attribute that she'd never experienced before. And in the same way, when we discover our natural, innate harmony with the Dhamma, then it will show us attributes of reality, attributes of our own experience that we've not seen before. But until we get to that point, there's a great degree of trust that has to enter into the process. We won't actually get to see it unless we're willing to put ourselves in that place. In that place of being very present and very intimate with the reality that we're presented with in a human life, the reality of death, the reality of sickness, the reality of change that we may or may not be willing to welcome. But once we do, then the Dhamma will naturally reveal to us these kinds of things. And the question might come to your mind, well, why naturally? How does that work? And the way that it works is that we are ourselves an expression of those principles. Some of you have heard me say this before. We are ourselves as human beings an expression of those very principles to which we are awakening. We are that thing. That's why the Buddha said, within this 6-foot body, or fathom-long body, for some of us it's less than 6 feet, for others it's a little bit more. Within this very body is all the teaching you will ever need. In this body and mind. He said also, without knowing the 5 khandhas, the mind in these 4 forms that we study in terms of the khandhas, so the sensation or the feeling tone, which we were looking at in the meditation today, the perception of a thing, the sort of labeling or identifying function, the sankhara, so volitional, especially volitional ideas we have about doing things or what our relationship to a thing is, and vijnana, this consciousness, the awareness that receives all of that, and the body. Rupa is the first of the 5 khandhas, so body and these 4 aspects of mind. So without really fully understanding those, you cannot be liberated, the Buddha said. But by fully understanding them, you can. You can. So there are a variety of ways that the principles of Dhamma are showing up in our lives, not just sickness, old age, and death, but also the very workings of the mind, the very workings of the body. So we did this meditation, I offered this meditation today as a way of having us tune into the interaction that is continually happening between the body and the mind and the environment. And one of the problems that folks face today, particularly when we are sheltering in place, is that we are faced actually with our mind perhaps more than we would have been in the past. More than we have been. Because we had lots of other opportunities for distraction. Right? Distracting ourselves with our friends, distracting ourselves by traveling, going on various and sundry adventures. Nothing wrong with all of that. In fact, the Dhamma practice can also happen right there in those places. But oftentimes, I would propose that it's very easy to allow activity to just fill up the mind, such that you don't have to look at it anymore. You don't have to see its workings and cope with what you see there. But now, perhaps, there are fewer opportunities for that. And so facing the mind and seeing what's in the mind, then we need some tools. We need some tools to be able to work skillfully with what we see there. And I would suggest that that is part of the reason why we have this great abundance of lists that the Buddha gave us, or I like to think of them as sort of frameworks, different frameworks. Because what he's doing is he's giving us the opportunity to take what can be a great mass of entanglement and look at individual parts of it. So the six senses is again another good example of that. In the third of his discourses, or so we understand it now, as the history has come down to us these days, in the third discourse, which is the Adita Pariyaya Sutta, the fire sermon, the Buddha describes all of a human life in terms of these six senses. And he says that each one of these senses and their sense consciousnesses and their objects and all of that is on fire. It's burning with dukkha, it's burning with a kind of fundamental unsatisfactoriness. But this fire metaphor for me is also really fascinating, because fire is a thing, especially those of us in California or in Australia, or folks who are in parts of the world where fire is very present from year to year. It has this incredible transformational power. Incredible transformational power. And this is both the good news, bad news, right? This is the difficulty that we have, that life is so fleeting and so volatile potentially. But it's also where the opportunity lies. It's also where the opportunity lies. To begin to see those inner workings, to begin to investigate the mechanics, if you will, of our experience, and begin to find that we can trust what we discover there, these principles, and allow that to unfold. Because the Dhamma has also that sort of process to it. It has, if we invest the energy and the investigation and the mindfulness and allow the joy to be present, then it develops its momentum. Its own momentum. And we still have to make some effort, but it's an effort that is carried along, if you will, by the strength of the Dhamma itself. There's some beautiful suttas toward the tail end of the Anguttaras, the linked discourses, in which the Buddha says, it is in the nature of things, right? It is in the nature of things that a person who lives an ethical life would be free from remorse. Okay, well that seems pretty logical. And then he says, and then one free from remorse will experience pamoja, will experience this kind of joy of reflecting on the good that you're doing. The joy of reflecting on a life well lived. One of many, many different kinds of joy that the Buddha spoke about. But then Pamoja, he says, now getting more deeply into the formalized practice, leads to, I'm not going to remember all 11 of them in exactly the right order, but Pamoja leads directly into the piti and the sukha. It leads into the meditative kinds of joy. And those then attract the mind. And then the mind will go, he says, it's in the nature of things that the mind will tend toward seeing things as they are. Yatha bhutang yanadasana. Seeing and knowing things as they truly are. And from there, then naturally, this kind of fading away of that which holds us to confusion begins to happen. And there's a clarity, and then there's a knowledge of a clarity and a peace. Again, why? Because we are made of those things. We are literally, the mechanics of body and mind have those tendencies built within them. At least that's how the Buddha described it. So we need only actually really find our harmony and our trust at the beginning. And we step into that beginning for as long as it takes. And then again, there's some momentum. So there's this beautiful balance. There's this beautiful balance which begins to develop of the intentional effort and then the momentum of the practice itself, the momentum of the Dhamma. So there are said, traditionally, there are a few different ways to establish trust, but one in particular that I want to point at this evening, which I've already been pointing out a little bit, is recollection of the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Recollection of the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. In fact, recollection of the Buddha is said to be one of the protective meditations, protecting you from, it's not a talisman, it's protecting you from ignorance. Remembering the incredible capacity that we as human beings have. Because the Buddha had so much confidence that if we were willing to be folks with little dust in our eyes, and I would propose that if you're here listening to this talk at this point, you qualify. Yay, that's right, Steve. If we're willing, then there can be nothing that would stand in our way. But the doubt can be very deep, and the doubt can be quite natural, actually, I would say. Just like Kayla, doubting whether she could float. Huh? She's never done it before. She's never seen anything but rocks drop to the bottom of the pool. Don't tell me that floating is possible, right? So again, coming back to recollection of the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, when doubt arises, the Buddha said one of the best ways of dealing with doubt about Dhamma or about the value of your life even is what? Is investigation. Have a look. How does it really work? Does it really work like he says it works? or like I say, works, or like some other talk that you've heard or text that you've read. How is it? How is it? Huh? The Buddha turning us again and again back to our own experience of inner and outer world. Him showing his faith in us. So I'm supposed to stop talking in just a few moments, but I do want to say a word or two about Kisa Gotami, because I think that she really, her story with the Buddha is so important to us these days. So Kisa Gotami, I'm going to tell it briefly, and I may tell it in a longer version on Saturday if folks are interested in that. She she lost her baby son, her baby boy died. And she was so grief-stricken that she went a little crazy. She really was unable to accept the death of her son. And she walked around carrying his body and asking people to help her bring him back to life. This is in northern India in the Buddha's time. And some very compassionate person sent her to talk to the Buddha. And she said to the Buddha, please give me some medicine that will make my son better again. And the Buddha said, well, I could make some medicine for you, but you have to go and get a mustard seed from a household that's never experienced death. So she set out to do that, and she went from door to door. And of course, she encountered only households where they had been touched by death, right? In one way or another. And she went from household to household to household until she finally realized that this experience that she was having of being touched by death was not just hers, right? That all of these people that she was encountering had also been touched by it in their own ways. And so in that moment, then she was able to actually accept the death of her son. So she buried her son and she went back to the Buddha and she became a nun, and she actually became one of the foremost Theris. The Buddha named her the foremost of the nuns who wore coarse robes, which means the nuns who wore the most humble of attire, who had taken up this ascetic practice of having the most humble attire of the monastic Sangha. And I tell this story again because it points very beautifully at the Buddha's confidence that even someone who was driven beyond their capacity of their heart and their mind by death in their life could turn to the Dhamma, could turn to the reality of what it means to be a human being and awaken from those very conditions. So I hope that you have the opportunity to recollect the Buddha in your life these days, that you take that opportunity, make that opportunity for yourselves, and that, like Kayla learning how to float, that you learn to find your harmony with the Dhamma, find your harmony with the reality, the principles that the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha are pointing to. Thank you.